Good morning. My name is Paul Lee, and this is my associate Rahul Rana. Today, we are going to discuss a recent ethical case within the automobile industry. It is about a company that, according to Fortune, is currently the biggest car maker in the world. It's about a company that netted $5.14 billion in 2016, according to the Wall Street Journal. It's also a company whose reputation has been tarnished by scandal and lack of ethics. This company is Volkswagen. Volkswagen's Dieselgate scandal was a hugely publicized incident due to it being one of the most audacious incidents of consumer fraud and false advertising in history. The affair involved the use of a defeat device in Volkswagen's diesel engines that sensed when the car was undergoing an emissions test and would alter its performance accordingly to meet federal standards. This allowed Volkswagen diesel cars to emit nitrogen oxide, a heavily regulated pollutant, and nearly 40 times the permitted levels. Once the EPA and the public found that Volkswagen was blatantly violating the Clean Air Act under the false pretense of clean diesel, they faced enormous public backlash, and according to CNN, a 43% drop in stock price. The question is raised, was it ethical for Volkswagen engineers to implement these devices? The ethical dimensions of this case provide insight into the corrupt corporate culture that dominated Volkswagen at the time. According to Fortune, former CEO Martin Winterkorn was an imperious martinet, whose almost autocratic leadership style created an intense pressure for perfection. He did, however, have a purpose for acting this way. He had a significant international reputation to uphold in an increasingly competitive market. In the face of nearly impossible demands to create a clean diesel car, engineers had to consider their obligations to their company and, more importantly, themselves and their families. They were faced with an ultimatum regarding their job security and made the choice that they believed would be in their best interests. Not only were their jobs at stake, according to a case study conducted by UVA, the consequence of failure for the German economy and reputation around design would be substantial. This was further rationalized by the fact that, according to CNBC, Volkswagen received a minimal punishment of only $120,000 for implementing similar defeat devices in 1974. On the other hand, engineers had to consider their obligations to society, which they failed to uphold by putting corporate interests and their temporary well-being over the health of the environment. According to the International Journal of Science and Engineering Application, by the end of 2016, Volkswagen cars with a defeat device produced enough toxic pollution to directly trigger the premature deaths of roughly 60 individuals in the United States. Also, the excess of nitrogen oxide, almost 36.7 million kilograms in 6 years according to GRIST, acted as a catalyst for heart disease, respiratory disease, acid rains, and more negative externalities from the use of this emission software.
So, to determine the ethicality of this, we looked at the Markula framework for ethics to consult 5 concrete ethical models to consider. Using the first model, the utilitarian approach, which focuses on maximizing the good done and minimizing the harm for all stakeholders, we could deem the engineers' actions as ultimately unethical. Although they did have obligations to their company and had to follow orders for their short-term well-being, the long-term costs of allowing nitrogen oxide to pollute our atmosphere outweighs their own interests. Current environmental laws today reflect the logical basis of this approach, as the health of the environment affects every living being on this planet. To remedy problems like these, while maximizing the good done, both internal corporate culture and the strength of external regulations must be reformed. Therefore, we propose a solution on 2 fronts, the internal and external. The internal solution would prevent fraudulent practices and reform corporate culture through expansion of internal oversight. This would be done through an augmentation of Section 406 of the Sarbanes-Oxley Act. The Act itself was a complete overhaul of corporate regulatory standards, enforced by the Securities and Exchange Commission. Section 406, according to the SEC, requires companies to disclose whether it has adopted a code of ethics for its senior financial officers. Our proposed amendment would expand this to all of upper management, including the supervisory board, executive directors, and the CEO himself. This would ensure accountability for all top officials in violations of ethics and would create a precedent for employees. The external solution is to strengthen regulatory standards and set a precedent for business ethics. We propose to give the EPA more jurisdiction and regulatory powers by augmenting its established compliance and enforcement process, which, in short, is that first, Congress passes a law to address an environmental problem, second, the EPA issues regulation, and third, the EPA enforces this with compliance assistance centers, which provide external oversight. The expanded powers will now allow the EPA to impose sanctions on specific products in accordance to congressional legislature. An example of a sound sanction would be levying tariffs or blocking the imports of goods that are deemed a threat to the environment or people's well-being by the EPA. In effect, this would cause massive economic pressure to change a firm's ways. This solution is sound in that it complies with the checks and balances of our government and the enumeration of congressional powers. Also, for Volkswagen specifically, the EPA would require them to concentrate on electric and zero-emission vehicles as a pragmatic yet green way of penalizing them for this incident. Our solutions are a sweeping reform on national politics, environmental legislation, and economic processes, showing that major changes require major propositions. Firms will not change their ways with simple fines and apologies. A stronger EPA will bring stricter civil and criminal enforcement, next-generation compliance and monitoring, and improved business ethics within society. Ultimately, we believe that both these solutions will act as practical reforms to the root causes of the problem. We thank you for your time and are open to any questions.